Guide and welcome to the Tudor Travel Guide's A to Z of Tudor places. And today we're going to be exploring Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire has been home to the Berkeley family for about 900 years. Wow! And that's with the exception of a 50-year period when it fell into the hands of the Crown. Now the castle sits perched up on a plateau which overlooks fields which stretch away below it, and it is an impressive sight. Its basic design is that of a motte and bailey construction. That was typical of the Norman period during which it was built. Of course, it later went further redevelopment in both the 12th and the 14th century as the family continued to bring the castle up to date as fashions changed. But the castle itself is highly distinctive. It's constructed from a local pink, grey and yellow Severn sandstone, and although it's impressive enough to us, we must remember it was never actually built as a fortress, but rather as a comfortable family home for the Berkeley family. But nevertheless, rather disparagingly, John Leyland, who was an antiquary and chronicler of the 16th century in England, referred to the castle in his itinerary as no great thing. Oops. Nevertheless, Berkeley Castle is considered today to be one of the supreme residential survivors of the 14th century, and so well worth a visit. Now, sadly, there is virtually nothing that remains of its early interiors or Tudor interiors, but it does retain most of its original external features like doors, arrow slits, windows, and even down to the iron catches. In the early medieval period, the castle is probably best known as the place of imprisonment of King Edward II, and rumours abound even to this day that the king's death at Berkeley in 1327 was possibly at the hands of his captors, who, if rumours are believed to be true, murdered him in a rather unspeakable fashion. Poor guy. Anyway, he was later buried at nearby Abbey at Gloucester, where his tomb can still be seen today. Then, in 1492, Berkeley Castle came into the ownership of the Crown, and this was a result of a bargain struck by William, who was then the Viscount Berkeley, who was to receive a marquisate and the title of Earl Marshal of England, one of the premier offices in the land, while in return King Henry VII would inherit Berkeley Castle upon the Marquis's death, and lo and behold, this he did. The castle then remained the property of the Crown throughout the remainder of Henry VII's reign and that of his son King Henry VIII. But from a Tudor lover's perspective, the most interesting event which occurred at Berkeley was the visit of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn during their historic 1535 progress. Well, the couple were about 1 month in to a 3.5 month long progress when they arrived at Berkeley, and they stayed there for the entire week. The castle was owned by the king at the time, and the constable or guardian of the castle was a little known Thomas Cromwell. And we know Thomas was there on account of the letters written and dated from the castle during his stay, and it's clear that he was busy continuing to oversee the visitations of the lesser monasteries, which had begun earlier in the progress and which heralded the end of the great monastic institutions in England. Now, unfortunately, due to the loss of all the archival records relating to the period of ownership when the Crown owned the castle, frustratingly, we have no further details of exactly what Anne and Henry did whilst they were at Berkeley. However, what we do have at Berkeley, and what undoubtedly makes visiting the property so worthwhile, is the exceptional state of preservation of the rooms that would have been used by the royal couple. And these rooms allow the visitor to get a real sense of how the chambers flowed from the public to the private in any high status house of the day. Now, as I said before, over the centuries, the less political Berkeley family had developed the castle from its early, rather drafty and austere Norman Motte and Bailey design, creating whole ranges of suites that were much more fashionable and comfortable and reflected the styles of the day. And today, if you go and visit Berkeley and pass underneath the gatehouse of the castle, you will enter a single courtyard and you will be surrounded by all these lodgings. To your left will be the medieval keep, and then around the buttressed curtilage wall are the remainder of the service offices and the privy lodgings used by Henry and Anne. Now, immediately in front of you, as was typical of the medieval period, you will find the Great Hall entered by a porch which takes you via a screen's passage through into the Great Hall, which is really one of those wow moments. It is impressive, and I think one of the finest in the country. You will see a typical low end demarcated by a screen's passage from the kitchen and buttery and pantry, and then a high end with a raised dais, and then a staircase which leads you up to the first floor and the principal privy chambers. Now, at the head of that staircase, there used to be an old chapel. This was converted, as we shall hear shortly, into a morning room, and that sits at an angle and connected to an outer chamber, which then leads on to an inner chamber. And this range filled much of the south side of the courtyard. And it is here in these very rooms that Henry and Anne, and we can imagine Henry and Anne dining or playing cards or listening to music as they whiled away those long summer evenings in the heart of the Gloucestershire countryside. And while you're there, there's a couple of very special features to look out for. The first is the wooden gallery in the outer chamber, and this once served as the privy gallery of the chapel. However, the gallery was moved from its original position by the 8th Earl of Berkeley in the early 20th century, when he undertook considerable renovations of the interiors, and when many of the older interiors unfortunately were lost. Now, this kind of gallery used to be commonplace. It allowed the high status people of the house to hear mass separately from the rest of the household. But it was then taken and moved to the morning room. But as we look at it, it's not beyond the realms of possibility to imagine that Henry and Anne may well have heard mass in the chapel from that very gallery. The second gem you need to look out for is at the head of the stairs. It's the wall hanging decorating the walls in the staircase, at the top of the staircase, in the lobby. Now, this is a deep red, rich material that's finely embroidered, and I've heard two versions of the origins of this wall hanging. The first was that it originally was brought to Berkeley with Anne and Henry and decorated their bedroom, and that somehow they left it behind when they left the castle. The second is that it once adorned Henry's temporary palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold. Now, both of these theories are intriguing, but unfortunately nobody knows exactly the nature of its origins. But we do know that the material is an exceptionally high quality, fit for a king, and that it has been dated at around 500 years old. Now let's turn to my rating for Berkeley Castle. As you know, I give a rating for locations based on a number of different factors. And these ratings are my Tudor Rose ratings out of 5. And for historical significance, I would give Berkeley a rating of 4 out of 5. One of the beautiful things about Berkeley is we know for sure that Anne Boleyn and Henry were there, and we can actually stand in the rooms that they used, and therefore that has a real significance to any Tudor lover. The second is the wow factor, and again I'd probably give Berkeley about a 4 out of 5 Tudor Roses. The wow factor really comes in the Great Hall, which, as I said, is one of the most impressive in the country. But authenticity I'd probably give Berkeley about a two roses, because although the overall structure of the rooms and the exteriors are authentic, unfortunately, because of these later redevelopments, much of the Tudor interiors, the earlier interiors, have been lost. And then accessibility, I'd certainly give Berkeley a 4 Tudor Rose rating. It is open throughout the summer months and can easily be visited and accessed, and there are lots of Tudor events including jousting and falconry and reenactments, so you can really go along and get in the spirit of the place. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Tudor Travel Guide's A to Z of Tudor Places. I'm Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide, and it's been a pleasure to give you this brief tour of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, and I look forward to seeing you for our next Tudor adventure. Until then, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling!